From a blonde wig that never moved to a 7-foot-tall publicity stunt double, the 1956 epic starring Richard Burton was plagued with bizarre production choices and historical blunders that make it one of Hollywood's most unintentionally hilarious ancient epics. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Alexander the Great. Fact 1. The immovable golden wig. Richard Burton's blonde wig in Alexander the Great became one of the most unintentionally comedic elements of the entire production, and for a very specific reason that had nothing to do with the actor's performance. The wig was so heavily lacquered and shellacked with hair products that it became essentially a rigid helmet of golden curls that never moved a single inch throughout the film's 2-hour and 16-minute runtime. This bizarre hair situation created some truly surreal moments on screen, especially during the film's action sequences and dramatic scenes. Whether Burton was charging into battle on horseback, engaging in heated arguments with his father King Philip, or supposedly sleeping, his blonde locks remained perfectly sculpted and motionless. The wig maintained its exact shape and position regardless of wind, rain effects, or the intense Spanish heat where the movie was filmed during the summer months of 1955. What made this even more noticeable was that the film was shot in vibrant Technicolor and wide CinemaScope format, which meant every detail of Burton's artificial hairpiece was clearly visible to audiences in stunning clarity. Critics and viewers at the time couldn't help but notice how the wig seemed to defy all laws of physics and nature, creating an almost helmet-like appearance that made the Welsh actor look more like he was wearing a decorative hat than actual hair. The lacquered wig problem became so obvious that it distracted from Burton's otherwise serious performance, with several contemporary reviews specifically mentioning the ridiculous blonde hairpiece. One film critic described it as looking like it was carved from wood and painted gold, while another noted that it appeared to be glued permanently to his skull. The wig's complete immobility throughout every single scene turned what was meant to be an epic historical drama into an unintentional comedy, at least where Alexander's hairstyle was concerned. Fact 2. Christopher Lee's secret voice work. Years before Christopher Lee became a household name as the terrifying Count Dracula in Hammer horror films, he was quietly working behind the scenes on Alexander the Great, providing voice dubbing work that most people never knew about. Lee was hired to dub the voice of actor Helmut Dantine, who played Nectanebus, the mysterious Egyptian soothsayer who serves as advisor to Queen Olympias and claims to be the true father of Alexander. This uncredited voice work happened in 1956, which was still early in Lee's career when he was taking whatever acting jobs he could find to make ends meet. At the time, Lee was just another struggling British actor trying to establish himself in the film industry, and voice dubbing work was a common way for actors to earn money between larger roles. The fact that he was chosen to replace Dantine's voice suggests that the Austrian-born actor's accent was considered too thick or inappropriate for the character. What makes this particularly interesting is that Helmut Dantine was actually a well-established actor who had appeared in major Hollywood films like Casablanca and Mrs. Miniver, but apparently his natural speaking voice didn't fit what director Robert Rossen wanted for the mystical Egyptian character. Lee's distinctive deep voice, which would later become so iconic in horror films, was used to give Nectanebus a more mysterious and otherworldly quality that matched the character's role as a supernatural figure in the story. The irony is that while Lee's voice work went completely unnoticed by audiences at the time, he would go on to become one of the most recognizable voices in cinema history just a few years later. This hidden contribution to Alexander the Great represents one of the earliest examples of Lee's voice being used to enhance a supernatural character, though audiences had no idea they were hearing the future Dracula speaking ancient mystical prophecies. Fact 3. The reluctant Aristotle. Barry Jones, the British character actor who eventually played the philosopher Aristotle in Alexander the Great, was incredibly difficult to pin down for the role, turning down the part not once, not twice, but 4 separate times before finally agreeing to appear in the film. This prolonged negotiation process became so frustrating for the production team that they almost gave up on casting him entirely. But director Robert Rossen was determined to have Jones play the famous Greek philosopher. The reason Jones kept declining the role wasn't because he didn't want to work with Richard Burton, or because he had other commitments, but rather because he wasn't satisfied with the financial terms being offered by the studio. Jones was a seasoned theater and film actor who had appeared in numerous British productions, and he knew his worth in the industry. Each time the producers approached him with what they thought was a reasonable offer, Jones would politely decline and suggest they find someone else for the part. What finally broke the deadlock was an unusual arrangement that gave Jones unprecedented control over his own compensation. On the fifth approach, the production team was so desperate to secure his services that they agreed to let Jones suggest his own salary rather than negotiating back and forth with predetermined figures. This was highly unusual for Hollywood at the time, where studios typically maintained strict control over actor salaries and rarely allowed performers to dictate their own terms. Jones finally accepted the role after naming his price, which apparently satisfied both his financial expectations and his sense of professional dignity. His performance as Aristotle became one of the few elements of the film that critics consistently praised, with several reviews specifically mentioning his authoritative and believable portrayal of Alexander's famous tutor. The irony is that after all the difficulty getting him to sign on, Jones delivered what many considered to be one of the strongest performances in the entire production. Fact 4. Charlton Heston's prophetic rejection. Charlton Heston was actually the first choice to play Alexander the Great in Robert Rossen's epic film, but the future star of Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments turned down the role with a remarkably insightful comment that would prove to be almost prophetic. When offered the part, Heston declined by telling the producers that Alexander is the easiest kind of picture to make badly, showing an understanding of the challenges involved in bringing such a complex historical figure to the screen. This rejection came at a time when Heston was still building his career in Hollywood epics, having already appeared in films like The Greatest Show on Earth, but not yet achieving the massive success he would later enjoy with biblical and historical dramas. His decision to pass on Alexander the Great suggests that he had already developed a keen sense of which projects were worth his time and which ones carried too much risk of failure. Heston's concerns about the difficulty of making a good Alexander film were rooted in practical considerations about the character and story. Alexander's life was incredibly complex, spanning multiple countries and cultures, involving numerous battles and political intrigues, and covering a vast time period from his youth to his death at 33. The challenge of condensing such an epic life into a single movie while maintaining historical accuracy and dramatic coherence was enormous. The actor's instincts proved to be remarkably accurate when the film was eventually released with Richard Burton in the title role. Critics and audiences found the movie to be exactly what Heston had predicted, a badly made epic that failed to capture the greatness of its subject matter. The film received terrible reviews, earned a 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and was even named the worst film of 1956 by Harvard Lampoon, vindicating Heston's decision to stay away from the troubled production. Fact 5. A 7'7" publicity stunt. United Artists came up with one of the most bizarre promotional campaigns in Hollywood history when they hired David Ballard, a man who stood an incredible 7 feet and 7 inches tall, to dress up as Alexander the Great and make public appearances to promote the film. This towering publicity stunt was part of the studio's massive $1 million advertising campaign, which was an enormous sum for movie promotion in 1956. The idea behind using such an extraordinarily tall person to represent Alexander was presumably to create a larger-than-life impression of the legendary conqueror, though historically Alexander was actually quite short by modern standards. The real Alexander the Great was believed to have been around 5 feet 6 inches tall, making Ballard more than a foot taller than the actual historical figure he was supposed to represent during these promotional events. Ballard would appear at movie theaters, premieres, and other publicity events, dressed in full Alexander the Great costume, complete with ancient Greek armor, weapons, and presumably a blonde wig similar to the one Richard Burton wore in the film. The sight of this giant man towering over crowds while promoting an epic about ancient Macedonia must have been quite a spectacle for moviegoers who encountered him during the film's release. This promotional strategy was part of United Artists' desperate attempt to generate interest in what they hoped would be a $20 million box office success. The studio spent $251,000 specifically on magazine and newspaper advertisements, and even took out 13 full pages in Life magazine to promote the film. They also commissioned a comic book adaptation as part of their multimedia marketing blitz. Unfortunately, despite all these elaborate promotional efforts, including the giant Alexander impersonator, the film only managed to earn $2.5 million by the end of 1956, making it a significant financial disappointment that fell far short of the studio's ambitious expectations. Fact 6. The Greek title disaster. The opening credits of Alexander the Great contain one of the most embarrassing linguistic mistakes in Hollywood history, with the filmmakers completely botching the Greek spelling of the main character's name in a way that would make any classical scholar cringe. Instead of properly spelling Alexander the Great in Greek letters, and the title cards display Alexander the Gresat, which is essentially gibberish that results from incorrectly using the Greek letter sigma in places where it doesn't belong. This glaring error happened because whoever designed the title sequence didn't understand how Greek letters work and simply substituted English letters with Greek ones without any knowledge of proper Greek spelling or grammar. The sigma letter, which looks like our English letter S, was randomly inserted into the name where it had no business being, creating a nonsensical combination that no Greek speaker would ever recognize as meaning Alexander the Great. What makes this mistake even more embarrassing is that the production had hired Prince Peter of Greece and Denmark as their official historical advisor, meaning they had access to someone who presumably understood Greek language and culture. Either the prince wasn't consulted about the title design, or the graphic artists ignored his input and went ahead with their incorrect version anyway. The error is particularly noticeable because the film opens with these Greek titles prominently displayed on screen, so every single person who watched the movie in theaters saw this linguistic disaster right at the beginning. For a film that was trying to present itself as an authentic historical epic about one of Greece's greatest heroes, starting off with a completely wrong Greek title was not exactly the best way to establish credibility with audiences. This wasn't the only language-related problem in the film, as the location names shown on maps throughout the movie were written in Latin rather than Greek, adding to the overall confusion about which ancient civilization the filmmakers were actually trying to represent. Fact 7. Royal Historical Advisor. Prince Peter of Greece and Denmark served as the official technical advisor for Alexander the Great, bringing genuine royal Greek bloodline and credentials to a production that would end up being filled with historical inaccuracies and cultural mistakes. The prince was born in 1908 and was the great-grandson of King George of Greece and Queen Olga, making him a legitimate member of the Greek royal family with deep connections to the country's history and culture. Having an actual Greek prince as historical advisor should have been a tremendous asset for ensuring authenticity in a film about Greece's most famous ancient hero, but unfortunately his expertise either wasn't properly utilized or was completely ignored by the filmmakers. The irony is that despite having access to someone with both royal Greek heritage and genuine historical knowledge, the movie ended up containing numerous glaring errors about Greek culture, language, and historical facts. Prince Peter was known for his intelligence and education, having appeared on British television programs like The Brains Trust, where he served as a panelist discussing various intellectual topics. He was also married to a Russian woman named Irina Alexandrovna Ovchinnikova, and he lived between Paris and London throughout his life, making him a sophisticated and worldly advisor who should have been able to guide the production toward greater accuracy. The fact that the film still managed to get so many basic details wrong while having a Greek prince on the payroll suggests that Hollywood's approach to historical filmmaking in the 1950s prioritized spectacle and entertainment over authenticity. Prince Peter's involvement was likely used more for promotional purposes and to lend prestige to the production, rather than as a serious attempt to create a historically accurate portrayal of ancient Greek culture and Alexander's life story. Fact 8. The changing wig colors. Richard Burton's blonde wig in Alexander the Great had a mind of its own when it came to color consistency, mysteriously shifting through different shades of blonde and gold from scene to scene in ways that defied all logic and continuity. Viewers who paid close attention during the film's 2-hour runtime could watch Burton's hair transform from bright golden blonde in one scene to a more muted honey color in the next, and then shift to an almost platinum shade shortly after. This color-changing phenomenon was particularly noticeable because the film was shot in vivid Technicolor, which meant that even subtle differences in hair color were amplified and became glaringly obvious to audiences watching in theaters. The problem likely occurred because the production used multiple wigs throughout filming, either due to damage, scheduling conflicts, or simply because they had ordered different versions from the costume department without ensuring they all matched perfectly. What made this continuity error even more distracting was that these color changes often happened within the same sequence, or even during conversations between characters, making it impossible for viewers to ignore. In some scenes, Burton's wig appeared to be a rich golden color that caught the light beautifully, while in others it looked almost yellow or artificially bright, in a way that clashed with the supposedly authentic ancient setting. The changing wig colors became one of the most frequently mentioned problems in contemporary reviews of the film, with critics noting that it was impossible to take the epic seriously when the main character's hair kept changing shades without explanation. This technical failure added to the overall sense that the production was poorly managed and lacking in the attention to detail that audiences expected from a major Hollywood historical epic, contributing to the film's reputation as a disappointing and amateurish effort despite its large budget and star power. Fact 9. Burton's previous Alexander failure. Richard Burton's path to playing Alexander the Great was marked by an earlier embarrassing failure that involved the same historical figure, making his eventual casting in the 1956 epic a strange kind of redemption story. Years before landing the title role in Robert Rosson's film, Burton had been hired to play Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and companion, in Terence Rattigan's stage play called Adventure Story, but he was fired from the production before it opened. Hephaestion was historically one of the most important people in Alexander's life, serving as his childhood friend, trusted general, and possibly his romantic partner, so being dismissed from this role must have been particularly stinging for the young Welsh actor who was still trying to establish his career in British theatre. The exact reasons for Burton's firing from Adventure Story were never made public, but it likely involved either conflicts with the director, problems with his performance, or personality clashes with other members of the cast. This earlier failure makes Burton's casting as Alexander himself even more ironic, since he went from being deemed unsuitable to play Alexander's best friend to being chosen as the lead actor to portray the legendary conqueror in a major Hollywood production. The transformation from fired supporting player to leading man in Alexander-related projects shows how much Burton's career had advanced in the years between the stage play and the film. What makes this career arc particularly interesting is that Burton would later go on to play another famous ancient ruler, Mark Antony, in the epic film Cleopatra, suggesting that despite his early setback with Alexander-related material, he had developed a talent for portraying powerful historical figures. His experience being fired from Adventure Story may have actually motivated him to prove himself worthy of playing these legendary characters, turning an early career disappointment into fuel for future success. Fact 10. The brutally edited epic. Director Robert Rosson's original vision for Alexander the Great was a massive 3-hour epic that would have provided deep psychological insight into the legendary conqueror's character and motivations, but United Artists studio executives took a hatchet to his carefully crafted film and cut it down to just over 2 hours. This brutal editing process removed substantial amounts of footage that Rosson considered essential to understanding Alexander's complex personality and the psychological forces that drove him to conquer most of the known world. Rosson was furious about the studio's interference and publicly criticized the severely edited version that was eventually released to theaters, claiming that United Artists had destroyed many of his most important character development scenes and psychological parallels. The director had spent considerable time and effort creating detailed sequences that explored Alexander's relationships with his parents, his internal conflicts about power and divinity, and the gradual corruption that came with absolute authority over vast territories. The cuts were particularly devastating to the film's second half, which originally included Alexander's invasion of India and his deadly march back through the Iranian deserts, as well as darker episodes like the paranoia-induced assassinations of his trusted generals Parmenion and Philotas. These scenes would have shown Alexander's transformation from idealistic young leader to ruthless dictator, but they were reduced to brief montage sequences that robbed the story of its emotional impact. Some scenes in the released version appear to have been edited so hastily that they don't make complete sense, with abrupt cuts to black and dialogue that seems disconnected from what comes before or after. Rosson believed that if audiences had been able to see his complete vision, they would have understood Alexander as a tragic figure whose greatness was inseparable from his ultimate downfall, rather than the one-dimensional conqueror portrayed in the studio's shortened version. Fact 11. Harvard Lampoon's worst film. The Harvard Lampoon, one of America's most prestigious and influential humor publications, delivered the ultimate insult to Alexander the Great by naming it the worst film of 1956, a distinction that was particularly embarrassing given the movie's enormous budget and impressive cast of established stars. This award from Harvard's famous satirical magazine was especially stinging because the Lampoon was known for its sophisticated wit and cultural commentary, making their criticism carry significant weight in intellectual and entertainment circles. The fact that Harvard Lampoon chose Alexander the Great over all the other films released that year shows just how spectacularly the movie failed to meet even basic standards of filmmaking quality. 1956 was a competitive year for Hollywood productions, with many other films competing for the dubious honor of being the year's biggest disappointment, but Alexander the Great managed to stand out as particularly awful, even among a crowded field of mediocre movies. What made this designation even more humiliating for the filmmakers was that the movie had everything going for it on paper: a massive budget from United Artists, Richard Burton in the lead role, respected actors like Frederick March and Claire Bloom in supporting parts, and an epic historical subject that should have guaranteed audience interest. The film was also shot in expensive Technicolor and CinemaScope format, with elaborate costumes and sets that represented a significant financial investment from the studio. The Harvard Lampoon's decision to single out Alexander the Great suggests that the movie's failures were so obvious and comprehensive that even college students could recognize its fundamental problems with storytelling, acting, and production values. This kind of recognition from a respected cultural institution helped cement the film's reputation as one of the most disappointing big-budget epics of the 1950s, a status that has followed it for decades. Fact 12. The anachronistic bookbinding. Alexander the Great contains one of the most glaring historical errors in cinema, when both Alexander and his tutor Aristotle are repeatedly shown reading from books that are bound and formatted exactly like modern publications, complete with pages that can be flipped from left to right. This is completely wrong for the time period, since bound books with sewn pages didn't exist in ancient Greece during the 4th century before Christ, when all written works were recorded on long papyrus or parchment scrolls that had to be unrolled to read. The movie shows these characters casually flipping through what appear to be leather-bound volumes with individual pages, just like books you might find in a library or bookstore today. In several scenes, Aristotle is seen teaching Alexander while holding what looks like a textbook, and Alexander himself is shown studying from similar bound volumes during his education sequences, creating a jarring disconnect between the supposed ancient setting and these obviously modern props. This mistake is particularly embarrassing because it involves some of the most famous intellectual figures in ancient history, and the scenes are meant to emphasize their scholarly nature and love of learning. Aristotle was one of the greatest philosophers and teachers of the ancient world, and Alexander was known for his education and intelligence, so getting such a basic detail wrong about how they would have accessed written knowledge undermines the credibility of these important character-building moments. The prop department either didn't research how books worked in ancient times, or they simply decided that modern audiences wouldn't understand scrolls, and chose convenience over historical accuracy. Real ancient Greek scholars would have used papyrus scrolls that were unrolled horizontally, often requiring both hands to manage while reading, and they would have been stored in cylindrical containers or on shelves designed specifically for scroll storage, not stacked like modern books on library shelves. Fact 13. The one-week box office champion. Alexander the Great achieved a brief moment of triumph at the box office during one single week in April 1956, when it managed to knock the popular musical Carousel out of the #1 spot and become the highest-grossing film in American theaters. This fleeting success was particularly remarkable because Carousel, the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical starring Gordon MacRae and Shirley Jones, had been dominating movie theaters and was considered one of the most successful films of the year. The victory was short-lived and almost certainly due to the massive opening weekend push that United Artists had orchestrated with their $1 million promotional campaign, which included extensive magazine advertisements, publicity stunts, and the coordinated release across multiple theater chains nationwide. For exactly 7 days, moviegoers were apparently curious enough about Richard Burton's portrayal of the legendary conqueror to make Alexander the Great the most popular film in the country. However, this box office championship lasted only until the following week, when Carousel reclaimed its position as the top-grossing film and Alexander the Great quickly tumbled down the charts as word spread about its poor quality and disappointing storyline. The rapid fall from first place to obscurity demonstrated that initial curiosity and heavy advertising could generate strong opening numbers, but couldn't sustain audience interest when the actual movie failed to deliver on its promises. This brief moment at the top of the box office charts became even more ironic when the final numbers were calculated at the end of 1956. Despite its 1 week of glory, Alexander the Great only managed to earn $2.5 million total, making it the 32nd highest-grossing film of the year and a significant financial disappointment for United Artists, who had hoped for $20 million in revenue to justify their massive investment in the production. Fact 14. Philip's missing eye patch. The historical King Philip II of Macedonia was famous for having lost his right eye in battle and wearing an eye patch for the rest of his life. But actor Frederick March portrayed him in Alexander the Great with both eyes completely intact, eliminating one of the most distinctive and well-documented physical characteristics of Alexander's father. This decision to ignore Philip's disfigurement was a clear example of Hollywood's tendency to prioritize attractive leading men over historical accuracy, even when the physical detail was crucial to understanding the character. Philip had lost his eye during the siege of Methone in 354 before Christ, when an arrow struck him in the face and permanently damaged his right eye, requiring it to be surgically removed. Ancient historians recorded this injury extensively, and it became one of Philip's most recognizable features throughout his reign as King of Macedonia, often mentioned in descriptions of his appearance and referenced by both allies and enemies when discussing the battle-scarred monarch. The missing eye wasn't just a cosmetic detail but represented Philip's reputation as a warrior king who led from the front lines and bore the physical scars of his military campaigns. His willingness to risk his own safety in battle was part of what made him such an effective leader and helped him earn the respect of his soldiers, so removing this element from his character reduced the historical Philip to a more generic royal figure. March was a distinguished actor who had won Academy Awards and could certainly have handled wearing an eye patch or makeup to simulate the missing eye, but the filmmakers apparently decided that audiences wouldn't want to see a disfigured character in such a prominent role. This choice reflected the 1950s Hollywood mentality that prioritized conventional attractiveness over authentic historical representation, even when the historical facts were well established and widely known among educated viewers. Fact 15. The 0% Rotten Tomatoes score. Alexander the Great holds the extremely rare and embarrassing distinction of having a 0% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, meaning that not a single professional film critic who reviewed the movie gave it a positive recommendation when the review aggregation website compiled its score. This perfect failure rating is based on 9 professional reviews that were collected and analyzed, with the average critic score landing at just 3.7 out of 10, indicating that even the reviewers who didn't completely hate the film still found it to be well below average quality. Achieving a 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes is actually quite difficult, since it requires every single professional critic to write a negative review without any dissenting positive opinions to break the streak of bad notices. Many movies that are widely considered terrible still manage to find at least one critic who sees some redeeming value or gives them the benefit of the doubt, but Alexander the Great was so universally disappointing that no professional reviewer could find enough good elements to recommend it to audiences. The fact that this rating is based on reviews from established film critics rather than casual moviegoers makes it even more significant, since professional reviewers are typically more forgiving of technical filmmaking efforts and are trained to look for positive aspects even in flawed productions. These critics would have understood the challenges of making historical epics and would have been familiar with the conventions of 1950s Hollywood filmmaking, yet none of them could overlook the movie's fundamental problems with pacing, acting, historical accuracy, and overall entertainment value. This 0% score puts Alexander the Great in the company of some of the most notorious failures in cinema history and serves as a lasting reminder of how even big-budget productions with respected actors and experienced directors can completely miss the mark when fundamental storytelling and filmmaking principles are ignored or poorly executed.